Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Welcome to FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is the founder of FDAImports.com and a former FDA regulatory counsel who helps companies worldwide navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight and international trade. I'm Leanne Lyon, and today we're talking about what's happening at the FDA, including import holds, labeling enforcement, and the compliance risks that can delay shipment or stop them entirely. Hello, Ben. Well, for listeners that may be new to your podcast, what is the statutory basis for the FDA's authority over imports and exports?
Great question. The Food and Drug Administration is bound and essentially mandated to ensure things like the wholesomeness, safety, effectiveness of FDA-regulated products through the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, which talks about foods, drugs, and cosmetics, but it also includes medical devices, biologics, tobacco is now covered, radiation-emitting devices, all sorts of things are dietary supplements, beverages, everything you can think of, almost that you put in your mouth or you put in your body is probably regulated by the FDA. And the FDA regulates interstate commerce. And one form of interstate commerce is importation because you're crossing a state line with goods, right? And so if you are bringing something from Florida, you make something in Florida and you ship it to your customer in Georgia, you're in interstate commerce, but you're not in international commerce. Right? These are state to state. And so because you're not an international commerce, there is a state border, but not an international border. So customs isn't at the border of Florida and Georgia, and FDA is not standing there either, but they are in the ports. And that's a bottleneck. The agency has the authority to inspect, examine cargo that's being imported, and the authority that the level of evidence they need to stop that cargo is much, much lower than it would be in the domestic setting. Right? So if I have a domestic company manufacturing something and selling it in interstate commerce in the United States, the FDA has authority, but it has to have more evidence to bring a regulatory action than at the border. So the authority comes from the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, essentially. So anything that's inbound and outbound. The provisions cover both exports and imports, and FDA spends a lot of its time examining cargo. The authority is very, very broad. The government does not have to have evidence that something is actually adulterated or actually misbranded or even actually unapproved. It only has to have the evidence that gives rise to the appearance of an adulteration or the appearance of misbranding. That's much, much lower evidence. And so the government's able to use that at the border where there's millions of transactions and shipments coming in every year in order to try to manage the compliance of those products because the evidence it needs to interfere with it and stop it is much, much lower.
Well, I mean, state to state, since you were talking about that, let's use California for an example. California has a whole bunch of restrictions that make it not possible for a company, say in Florida, Minnesota, Texas, to ship to California. Does the FDA get involved with that, or is that a California responsibility then?
Good question. This actually comes down to supremacy, right? The supremacy clause in the Constitution says that the federal government, the federal law is supreme. It's higher than state law. But that doesn't make state law not valid. It just means that if there's a conflict between state and federal law wins. So if the state allows a certain conduct A, but the federal government prohibits it. I have an example. Let's flip it. We'll use this one. Cannabis. Okay, a lot of states have made it legal to do lots of things related to cannabis, and the federal government has not done that. It's still a Schedule I controlled substance. Now, there's enforcement discretion, and so that's a policy decision. But if it comes down to which is going to win, the federal government is going to win that case. If it comes down to which law is going to apply, and so the answer is no. That's different. That's where the state law is allowing you to do something that the federal law does not, right? So the federal law has the prohibition. Flip it. let's say the federal law says that you are allowed to have 10 parts per million of lead in every ounce of baby food. Okay. And I just made 10 parts per million. I just made that up. I
Totally
have no
made it
idea what the actual level is for lead in baby food. But California says no, you are only allowed to have 5. Okay. That's not a conflict because you can comply with the federal law and the state law at the same time because 5 is less than 10, right? If state had said 15, right? No, not valid because this is the rule because it's the Fed rule. So California is going to be allowed to make rules that are more strict under food and drug than the federal law does, and so that's a state law question. Proposition 65 is a really good example of that. And there's a lot of litigation that I get involved with sometimes, where companies are being hit by claims that their product contains lead or cadmium or PFAS or something else at levels that are legal under the federal regime, but they're not legal in California.
Well, Texas is another state where they've said we're going to restrict or we're going to put labels on foods that have a particular ingredient in them if they're not removed by such and such a date. And that's, again, you said earlier about the FDA needs to stay relevant to the current administration. And so that's one example. Texas basically has said, okay, we're going to stay relevant because we're going to make sure that what some people are saying are harmful ingredients, we're going to make sure that we outlaw them. But how does the FDA manage things like that?
It depends upon how invested the agency is in the issue. And whether or not the issue is truly a safety issue. They tend to not get into fights with the states if it's just about labeling things that are not safety related. Now, the industry doesn't like that because the industry now can run into a situation where they have 4 or 5, 6, or 50 different labeling regimes, which is not functional, right? Because how you have to make 50 different labels in order to sell. How many you need for California versus North Carolina? I mean, so that doesn't work, right? And the purpose of the federal law is to normalize all that so you don't have that problem. So that becomes sort of the argument. But the FDA pretty much stays out of it unless there's a safety related piece. There's something safety related. They tend to stay out of it. Their relevance now. You mentioned the idea of relevance, which we were talking sort of before we got on today. But all of the agencies have to figure out how they're going to be relevant into this administration. Because if you're a federal agency and you're not relevant to this administration's policies, you might be shut down, right? So relevance is actually pretty important. FDA has been beaten up pretty badly over the last 18 months because of the issues, all sorts of issues. And I'm not going to pick on. I'm not going to pick on them, but they're in the pharmaceutical space, they're in the food additive space, they're in the testing space, they're all over the place where they've been taking hits. Um, and so how does the FDA become relevant? Well, they have this authority at the border. International trade and restriction of international trade is a high, or is considered largely, I think, to be a pretty high policy um, pillar in this administration. And the government, FDA, can impact that because they interact with a ton of international cargo. And so I see them being relevant there. I see the agency. When I say relevant, I'm not talking in literal terms. I'm talking in political terms, sort of politically relevant to this administration. And so I see the agency just doing things that they never had done before, and taking positions, the way that they're doing inspections, the kinds of conduct, the kinds of actions that they're enforcing. It's been very challenging, I think, over the last for importers to predict what the government is going to do with their imported cargo. So um, I would, and that's not a state issue, right? Because these ports are all over the country, whether it's in Texas or California or New York or Chicago, Illinois, whatever.
And believe it or not, even Minnesota with the Great Lakes.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, the northern tier. They call that the northern border is a very different border than the southern border. The Southwest Import District, we used to be called SWID, versus the northern tier. They have different names for it, but Buffalo, Michigan, Minnesota, the Peace Bridge up there. There's a very different types of borders. Even the land borders are very, very different. The types of trade that's coming across, the volume is substantially greater in the Southwest than it is from the northern tier. The variety is greater from the Southwest than from the northern tier. And then these land borders compared to airports, inland ports like Chicago, compared to Newark, Seaport, or Miami, which or it takes both. They get a lot of air traffic in from South and Central America, fresh produce in Miami. So all of these create nuance to how the FDA interacts with cargo.
And how are those nuanced?
So part of it is the degree to which the officers have been in the ports for a period of time, right? Because they sort of know what to look for. When I was at the FDA, right as I left was the beginning of the predict era, which is a sort of an AI-driven, evolutionary algorithm-driven screening system. And I wrote the original statement of work for predict at the FDA. It was like the first time they started using that kind of technology. So they use electronic screening, but there is nothing like officers who have been at the port for a long time who just tend to know what to look for, right? And they just know they see it and they go, that's wrong, whatever, and have a look at it, and sure enough, it's the thing that they thought. And I'm not even sure you can even articulate what it is. Now, you used to have more of that in the land borders than you do in the seaports, because how are you going to do it with that with a freighter, right? With a container ship, as opposed to truck after truck after truck. You're talking about individual drivers pulling one load, and you have a little bit more sort of like experience that officers can use there. So yeah, how they inspect, the kinds of cargo that's coming in. Certain ports are used to getting certain kinds of cargo. LA, Long Beach, LAX, Long Beach are getting a lot of Asian cargo. Not so much of it coming into to New York or Newark. They're getting a lot of European cargo. They do get Asian cargo, but far more of it is European. That changes the types of cargo that's coming in. And so you end up with different enforcement regimes because they're used to certain kinds of problems. So yeah, the different types of port does impact the way that the inspectors operate. Now, what I'm talking about though is a little different. It used to be that the FDA, let's say I bring something in and it's got a labeling problem. It's otherwise been tested and it's fine, right? But there's a mistake in the labeling. Well, the label, I tell people all the time, get your labels right, because it's the easiest and cheapest offense that the government can bring an action against. It's right in front of them, right? They don't have to test it. They don't have to smell it. They don't have to open the jar, right? The label's got a mistake. That's misbranded. And the government can keep it out based upon misbranding. They can make you change the label or destroy the cargo or export it. Now, it used to be they tested it for salmonella and it was clean, and they find that they say, by the way, you got a mistake in your label, you get a release with comment. And that is the comment is going to be, your label is misbranded. Don't do it again, fix it, right? And then it would go into cargo, into commerce. But now they're saying, your label is misbranded, fix it. Okay. And that's changed. They didn't used to do that. They are looking for so the government, the FDA is taking a much more harsher stance in imported cargo than they did before, and I think this goes to the relevance thing. They want to be relevant to this administration.
I've heard statistics something like 80% of American businesses are small businesses. And I've also heard it said that small businesses often feel the FDA is more pro big business, and that the small businesses really become kind of a thorn in its side. Can you speak to that perception?
Sure. Well, the first fact you said, I mean, I don't know if the number is correct, but I do know that this disproportionately FDA's regulated inventory is small businesses. And this is particularly true in the food space. Something like 78. I mean, I've heard 75 to 80%. I don't know what the numbers actually are now, because I heard that when I was writing regulations for the FDA under the Bioterrorism Act, right? I mean, that was when we were looking at that data. But it's true that disproportionately FDA regulated industry is small businesses. It's not until you get into the industries that are involved with how am I going to put it? Like a higher risk related health. So like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biologics, rad health, things like X-ray machines and ultrasound machines and stuff like that. When you get into that, those tend to be obviously larger businesses because you need to have the money to do the research, or else you don't have a product. But if take all that out of it, and you're dealing with cosmetics, basic foods, which is a lot of different kinds of foods, and those are small businesses. Um, Small businesses are easy targets. The government a lot of times will use small business targets in order to test a theory, which is quite frankly, in my opinion, unfair. Where they have a particular view, the government thinks that the industry is going in a direction they don't like, and so they pick a couple people that are doing it, and they try those tests, this legal test against those industries, against those companies. And those companies tend to be not necessarily smallest, right, but on the smaller side of the scale. And because they know that there's going to be less likelihood of them having the resources to actually defend themselves. Is it intentional? I don't know what the people in the government think or what they think they're doing. I will tell you this: that having worked at the FDA, I was at the FDA for 17 years. If it hadn't been for the FDA, I wouldn't have worked for the government. It's a great mission. The people that work there that I worked with, and I think that this is still true in large measure, are believers, right? They believe that what they're doing is protecting the consumer from products that are unsafe, and they're not interested in retaliation. They're not interested in politics, right? They're just doing their job. And if that's who you're interacting with, it's not going to matter if you're small, medium, or large. They're going to have the same attitude. It's the policymakers is where you run into that problem, in my opinion. If you have a problem, it's going to be at the top levels of the agency, and where they're driving the programs, right? What are those good, faithful servants going to spend their time on? That's where right? They don't have the choice. They just have to do what they're told. But those decisions are made higher up, and I think the perception is legitimate. That it's easier to go after smaller targets than it is to go after bigger targets, particularly if the bigger targets are paying user fees and therefore your resources. We just had a shutdown. The FDA was 86% operational. 86% operational during a shutdown. That's not because they have good big hearts. It's because their user fees are not appropriated. That's why. 86%, right? So that I'm not saying whether you should have that much or not. I'm just saying when you got that much, you start running into the risk that it at least appears to be that there could be disparity in how the agency acts.
When you said 86% not appropriated, can you explain that a little more clearly?
The federal government is its authorities are limited, and it has to be the government has to be granted authorities to do things by the states, and the Constitution is where that comes from. And if they don't have the authorities, then they can't do it. Well, the way that the government actually acts is it gets appropriations, it gets money from the general fund, right? Most government agencies are funded by our tax dollars. When 86% of the government is still operating, even though the government is shut down and not getting taxpayer money, where's the money coming from? Not coming from the general fund, it's coming from user fees. Who pays user fees? The regulated industry pays the user fees.
Right.
So pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, even registrations of food companies, cosmetic companies, medical device companies, they're all forms of user fees. And the government is getting paid by the industry. Now, some would say, shouldn't the industry, in fact, pay for its regulation? Okay, arguably, yes. But you also have run the risk, I think, of the appearance of impropriety when you have a government agency that can operate 86% functional when you have a shutdown of the federal government. That should make some people scratch their heads. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying, come on.
And I think you were saying also then it's less likely that the smaller businesses are part of providing that 86%
No.
as well.
Yeah, they wouldn't be, and that's right. And a lot of the smaller businesses, the problems they had was getting the government to act on shipments that had been locked up, and you couldn't get the government to answer the phone. And they were afraid to ship the cargo because if the government suddenly starts operating tomorrow, they're going to say, "Where's my cargo? Where's your cargo? I didn't release it." No, you didn't release it because you were watching Netflix all damn weekend, all week long because you didn't work. It's not their fault, but whatever, right? You can't blame me for that. So the small businesses were interacting with the shutdown, because those people in large measure were not funded by user fees.
Right.
So yeah, it definitely had a disparate impact on smaller businesses, the shutdown.
Well, thank you for your time today. This is always a joy to be here with you and learn from you. You have so much knowledge, and it's just a blessing. So
Great. Look, if anybody has questions about what the government's doing, where it's headed in this administration, I would say it's anybody's guess, but it doesn't hurt to have someone who has a pretty good idea of what he sees. So give us a call.
That's it for today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. If your company is importing FDA-regulated products and you need guidance on preventing shipment issues or responding when something gets detained, refused, or flagged, visit FDAImports.com to connect with Ben and his team. If this episode helped you, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review so you catch the next one.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.